Guys, welcome back to another video. In this video we're gonna learn how to create the student's account on our system using API. Now we're gonna use the API thing as an oops implementation, meaning we'll have a class, let us say create student, which will extend the API class in order to have some features that the API class will provide. So to make you understand this in a simpler word, I'll say we have this base class called as API. So we have this API class. Now in this class, what we have is a method which will allow what HTTP method. So as you already know, there are different HTTP methods like get, post, etc., which are used to call the API, right? Get, post, put. Okay, so there are different methods. Now what we want is we want that our API should be accessible through only some of these methods. For other methods it shouldn't be like accessible. So what we have to do, so this is our API class. I'll draw another class. I'll say this is our create student or let us say student account class. So we have this student account class right here. Cool. So what we actually want to do is we want that this is a student account API. Now what will happen is we can have multiple other APIs like student update API, or we can have like a number of different APIs, and we want that all of these APIs should be verified for the method that is being used to call them. So I want all of my APIs to be called through get or through post. Or let us say I want to call this one through get and this one through post. So there might be different requirements for each, but the common condition is that all of these APIs should not be accessible through the other methods which we don't want them to be accessible with. So for example, if I want student update to be accessible via get, then it should not be accessible via the other methods. So how we are going to do that? We can either do these for every API that we write, or what we can do is we can create a base class API, and what we can do is we can implement this functionality over here. So what we'll have is we have this API class. So I'll have an array. So I can say array, which I'll call allowed methods. Okay, so this will be an array in which I'll store that all the methods that I want to allow. For example, get or post or both of them. So this is the allowed method. Now, I'm also gonna have one function called. So I'll just write this is an array. This is an function, which will be like validate method. And what it will do is we'll pass the array of methods, and it will check that whether these methods are like allowed or not. So we'll get to it. So what we're gonna do is whenever the object of student account class is created, this constructor will call the constructor of API class and will pass the allowed methods of this class to the method of API base class. So let's head over to code and see what I'm actually speaking about. So the first thing I have did is class student account extends API. Now in allowed methods array, I have stored post variable so that my API is accessible only via post method. Then what I'm gonna do is in the constructor of my parent, like student, sorry, in constructor of my child class, what I'm doing here is I'm calling the constructor of parent class, and I'm passing this allowed method array, which is basically this one. So I'm saying that validate method of base class, please make sure that other methods should not be allowed to access this API. Only methods that should be accessible, this API will be the allowed methods. So in API, what I have done, so this is the allowed methods uh, array that we had, and now this is the constructor of base class, and what we have done here is the constructor is taking some arguments or some parameters which are basically this allowed method, so which is basically this array that we want this particular API to be accessible via. So this array containing the post element will come here and it will be copied to the allowed method of this parent class. Now what we are also doing here is calling the validate method. So basically validate method will check whether the given method, now the method using which this API is called, will be accessible for us using the $_server super global variable. Now in this super global variable, we will get the name of the HTTP method that is being used to call this API. So we will check whether this method is there in the allowed methods or not. So if it is there, we'll continue with our execution, and if it is not there, what we will do is we will set the response payload as an entity error, and we'll say that the API does not support this method. And what we'll do is we'll call this arrow send response along with the response payload. So what response will do is it will send the JSON in the correct format, and it will simply stop the execution. So this was the API class. Now that if the API is called using any other method, then the execution will stop. But if the API is meant to be called from post and it is being called using post, then the execution will continue and will be here and will copy all the request payload to a variable of this class called request payload, and then we will validate the fields. Now why do we need to validate the fields? Because we need to make sure that, for example, I have an API which should be called only by the authenticated users of my platform. Anonymously this API should not be accessed. So what we can do is we can implement this authentication using this validate field. What we will do is we will have one parameter or one payload, like one parameter in request payload that has to be there. We will call it API key. So we will check whether this API key is there in payload or not. If it is not there, what we can do is we can simply send an error entity again saying that requested parameters or required parameters are not present, right? And if it is present, we'll make sure that API key is not empty, and if it is filled, then we will check it against our database whether this API key is a valid API key or not. So fair enough. Along with this, for example, I am writing an API for creating the student account. For creating a student account, it is necessary that I should at least have the student name, student email, and student password. So all these are also required fields. So what I have over here is required fields. So these three fields are required, and all fields are the same because there are no additional fields that are there besides the required fields. So okay, now what we will do is we will check that required fields are there in the request payload or not. If they are not there, we will say that again we will pass an entity error and we'll say that required parameters are not present in the payload. And we'll kind of iterate through all the request payloads, and we'll see whether any of them are empty or not. If they are empty, if empty request payload, then what we will do is we will send back another error entity saying required parameters are not present. So we will do that required parameters are empty. So we will pass this error message saying that required parameters are empty. Okay. Next, what we will do is we will take the request payload, and we will only see what kind of values do we need. So in this, we want student name, student email, and student password. If a hacker or another user tries to pass any other value, let us say credit card number or any other detail that is not required, then in this step what will happen is we will see that what are the all fields that we have. So we will only take the data that we know that we want, and we will discard rest of the data. Cool. So by now we have all the fields here in our this arrow request payload. So what we are gonna do is we are gonna create a student account, and we're gonna say student create account. So we will call the create account method. So for now what I have done is I have simply said in create account you will just ring back whatever request payload that has arrived. So what is the request payload? Student name will be the key and value will be whatever the name user submits. Student email will be the same, again whatever email the student submitted, and password will be the password that student submitted. Fair enough, and we will just send this back. So I'll go back to our internship portal. I'll refresh this page. I'll say I'm Ajinkya. This will be my email, password, let us say 123, and a confirm password 123. So as you can see, API call was successful. Find the details below. So this was the JSON that our API returned. So what we have to do now is we now have the data here. So the first thing that we need to do is uh, what we have to do is hash the password, or we can say we need to filter these fields for any like malicious content before we go ahead and use this data. Wait a minute. What we actually are doing right now is actually starting with the process, and I'll keep coding, and what will happen is you guys won't follow what code I'm writing because you might not be familiar with the functions and all. So what I've done here is I have tried to explain what's going on, so we'll go through it side by side. So first thing what is happening is whenever the form will be submitted on the client side, we are calling an AJAX request which will send the student name, student email, and student password in an AJAX call, which will be a HTTP post method will use for calling the API. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go back to the previous video and you can look what an API is and then resume watching the video from here. Anyways, if you are continuing from the last video, you'll know what the API is. Now, as we already know, we are receiving all this data on the server side as well. So while we are on the server side, the very first thing that we need to do is to make sure that the API which is meant to be called from post method is actually being called from post method and not using any other methods. For that, we will use validate method function. Now what is happening is there can be n number of different APIs that we write. So this one is for create student account, another will be for student or like create faculty account and so on. So basically what we have to do is we have to validate the method for every API. So what we can do is we can actually include this validate method in the as a public function of API class. Now what we will do is whenever we use the create student account class, we will create it as a child class of API class. So whenever we need to validate a method in the constructor of this child class, we will call the constructor of this parent class and will make sure that the object whichever is created will validate the method. Now what we have to do is next thing after validating the method, we have to validate the fields. So fields meaning parameters etc like payload which is passed in the request. So student name, student email, and student password is the payload of this request. Now what we have to do is we have to validate. Actually what we need to do is we are actually